Okay, so shall we make a start?
Yes, I start the recording.
Thank you. So welcome everyone to this month's Let's Code Together. My name's Jane Knight and I'm a clinical associate with the MEDRA MSSO, and I'm joined by my colleague Dr. Caroline Wilson, one of our medical officers.
Hello, welcome everyone from Berlin in Germany.
It's very nice. Welcome back if you've joined us previous months. We've been offering these sessions every month, so if it is your first one, you're very welcome, and if it isn't your first session, then welcome back. We're pleased to have you back with us. The first slide just explains that MEDRA was developed in the mid-1990s. It was an ICH initiative, and at the time the MSSO was put in place to maintain and distribute MEDRA. The activities of the MSSO are overseen by a management committee with representatives from the industry and the regulatory authorities across the ICH regions. The next slide is a copyright notice that explains that MEDRA is owned by ICH, as is the material we're going to present today. So if you do reference anything or reuse the material, then you need to acknowledge ICH as the owners. We'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. We aim for it to be a workshop format, and the way we can best do this when there are a number of you online is to use the questions or chat panel on the right-hand side in your GoToWebinar screen that you can ask questions or put your comments in. Sometimes it may be that if we do have differences of opinions on the terms, we may have to agree to disagree just in the interest of time. We can't take questions today, how do I code this particular term? We can't do that instantly via the questions, but what we will do is that we have a survey at the end, and there will be an option for you to propose new examples for us to consider and hopefully include in future sessions. But please, can these be of general interest that would be applicable to the wider audience? And I will add there that quite a number of the examples that we do use, particularly this month and regularly now, do come from previous suggestions from other sessions. So we'd like to make this interactive also with some quiz questions. And again, you may be familiar with our webinars that offer this. So there are two ways you can join. The easiest way is to join with your mobile phone, and you can scan the QR code. That's the square barcode that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. Alternatively, you can use either an internet browser on your mobile phone or on your computer. You open a browsing screen, and in the URL bar at the top, you type in polev.com, polev.com. Then you need to link to our presentation, and you do this by entering my name, so Jane Knight 855. You see that there's step 3, and that will allow you to click join, and you can link to the presentation. So those are two ways you can do it if you wish to join us for the quiz. If you don't catch the details here, the details are in the chat. If you have a look in the chat, you can scroll up and see how to do it. So it's you need to open something like Safari or Chrome and type it into the URL. So the first one gives you an opportunity here to join and check if it works. Show us where you are today in the world. Where are you in the world? I'm expecting a lot of you from North America, maybe some of you in South America. No one in South America, or someone in Europe?
But
UK?
Mexico.
Mexico. No? No? So, well, wherever you are, we're very pleased to have you with us. We want to give you an opportunity to view MEDRA yourself, and you can do this with a browser. You may have your own in-house browser or your own version of our MSSO browser downloaded or with your own credentials. But if you don't have access to a browser, you can use our web-based browser. If you have a look there on the home page, it shows you where you find the link, the web-based browser link. The username is training. And there's the password. And Caroline's going to put these details in the chat for us. So if you forget or you don't catch it, You can either take a snapshot with your phone or you can see it in the chat. So that's so that you have access. It's a temporary web-based browser access that will be valid until Friday of this week. So then what we always say is that coding, we often find there's not an exact match, and this is one of the challenges. Sometimes there's more than one possible term or more than one possible approach. And even the points to consider document offers us options in places for handling different types of terms. Sometimes it's a case that we understand the terms differently. Carol Ann and I find this, that when we read a verbatim term, we often have initially our thoughts are very different about what a term means. And it's only through discussion and research that we come to an agreement. So this is one of the issues we have. And overall coding, it isn't always black and white, and we need to represent the events that we have reported by a best approximation. But overall, the golden rule is that we always code as reported. We don't make assumptions. So here's an example. We always have a picture like this, and you can see here, what are we looking at here? What is this? Is it a mountain? I see there's a little man there. Is it a mountain? Or if you stand back a bit and you look differently, is it a very large dog reclining on a mound of white snow or something there? So is it a mountain or is it a dog? And this is the same so with the verbatim terms. Which way do you look at it? And coding is all about a balance between applying rules for consistency, but also using medical judgment so that we can manage risk to patients. Medical references are useful, and you'll see that particularly today in some of the examples that we've brought along for you. Sometimes you find that the concept you're looking for isn't actually in MedRA, and it may be necessary for you to request a new term to be added so as to represent that reported concept. So these are all the challenges we have. And having said all of that, I'm going to switch my camera off because I find it distracting, and let's code together. The first example we have is ground glass opacities. Ground glass opacities. And the first question that I would think to myself is, well, is the verbatim clear enough? Is it clear what's actually being reported there? Is it a condition? Is the opacity a condition? Or is it a test result? Is it something that's appeared? Opacity makes me think it's an imaging or a result. And if it's whatever we decide, what would be the best LLT for that? So our first reference that we tend to look at first would be Dorland's. And although initially I didn't think ground glass would be in Dorland's, when we looked, we did find it there. And ground glass is defined as having a filmy, hazy appearance, as in radiographs of a lung containing excess fluid. So they give us the example of a lung or chest x-ray there. So it looks like it is a test result. Is this a condition or a test result? We looked for further on the web and found a reference which said ground glass opacification or opacity is a descriptive term referring to an area of increased attenuation in the lung on computed tomography or CT. But the second paragraph there says it can also be used in chest radiography, so chest x-ray. So we're not sure, is it always going to be a chest x-ray, or is it could it be a CT scan? So we're not even sure what the result would be. And here, this confirms it. Another reference we found, which actually shows what it looks like, what the opacity looks like on both the chest x-ray and a CT scan imaging. So we're not clear. It seems from our references, seems that predominantly it's lung, that it's a chest or lung result. So what do you think? Having seen those references, what would you code that to? You can use your browser, Canada. I think we're on the, where are we coming from in the world? Welcome anyone who's with us from Canada. You're very welcome. Oh, somebody's giving us the numbers. Query, one of you would query to see whether it is actually lung. That's a valid comment there. It may be that you have more information when you actually have the full case. you may have more information available. Somebody says it's an unevaluable event because they're not sure. Perhaps that's the site. Respiratory system, you think it's respiratory system. So, shall we move on? Let's have a look and see. Anyone else got a comment to put there? Seems like a lot of you are saying lung opacity. Could go to ground glass opacity in thoracic CT or ground glass opacity on chest X-ray. Thank you for that, whoever's entered that. Now, there are 2 LLTs in MEDRA that give us those options, either a thoracic CT or chest X-ray. So let's have a look. Someone else says they need to query to look for the location. So let's browse MEDRA ourselves. I'll have a look and go to the website, go to the web-based browser link, just as I showed you. And here we are. So let's have a look at ground glass. It's the starting point. Use the words, use the reporter's words. Ground glass, and what do we have? We have 3 terms: ground glass appearance, which we see as non-current, and if we look at the hierarchy for that, we can see why. It shows us that that one is actually placed to a liver disorder. Ground glass appearance is a liver term, so perhaps it is ambiguous as to the site. Or we have here ground glass opacity in thoracic CT, codes to the PT of lung opacity, which was what you gave me, and ground glass opacity on chest X-ray. One of you mentioned these 2 LLTs, and there they are, both of them linking to the PT of lung opacity. So we can see, I'll just have a quick look underneath to see if there's anything else we've missed that may be better there. So we can see it's, so from a MEDRA perspective, MEDRA places these lung opacity, it places the ground glass opacity under the lung opacity, but the 2 LLTs do specify the test results, either a CT or a chest X-ray where the finding, but it can be, we're in the respiratory SOC, so it's treating it as a disorder, not as a investigation result, which is interesting. And the liver one is non-current. So we had a look at quite a few more references than what we've shown you here. And it seems that lung seems to be predominantly the most common site that's used for that expression of ground glass opacity. But just as you've said, we would not only use our medical references, but we would not make assumptions. And if we were unsure, we would query. It may be that you know the test that's done, or you know the problem that the patient has, and what would fit around the context would be lung. But it seems, looking at what we saw, we think that the term is commonly used to refer to lung, and we would code it to lung opacity. If you knew the test, then you could select one of the more specific LLTs, or it wouldn't be wrong if you chose to query to be sure. So that's what we would do with this one. Do we have any comments on that one, Carol Ann?
No questions, no comments.
No, that's good. Well, if you have got comments, send them in. And we'll move on to our second example then. Hyperphonesis was all that was reported. Hyperphonesis, is this clear enough? What is it here? Are there any suitable synonyms? And what's the most appropriate LLT? Well, when I see that one, I immediately see hyper and know that it's an increase or an excess of something. And then phonesis makes me think of sound or voice, phonetic, phonesis, something to do with sounds. So a lot of high increase in sounds. So looking in Dorland's, hyperphonesis means an increase in intensity of vocal sound in auscultation or percussion. So increase in sounds, I'm not sure it's a vocal sounds, but to me it sounds like it's another test result. That's what, again, I'm thinking, it sounds like a test result, because it's from the percussion test or a auscultation. So having seen those references, here we'll give you a multiple choice this time. Which LLT of these would you select? Which LLT here would you select? I had a look through MEDRA because it seemed that it was, based on the Dorland's definition, it seemed that it was some sort of physical examination, and here are all the tests: breath sounds, heart sounds, hearing test. Which one do you think it would be the most appropriate? The details are on the top of the slide, so if you haven't managed to log on to the poll, I see there's not too many of you yet logged on. So if you want to join, you can log on. The details are at the top, Jane 9855. And if you want, I can make that. You can click on this if anybody needs it. There it is. Okay, so let's move on. What have you gone for here? Percussion test abnormal is the most common, the most popular option there. Remember, it said percussion or auscultation. So we've got breath sounds, hearing tests, somebody thinks with the phonesis, and a few of you would like to query it. That's the final result there. 55% of you have gone for percussion test abnormal. And that fits with what we've seen in Dorland's, doesn't it? So let me have a look. Let's see if do we know it? Presumably it's not in MEDRA. Let's have a look if there's anything else with phonesis. Let's have a look. And if it was in there was hyperphonesis, it would turn up. Now, what's interesting is there is an existing term in MEDRA of hypophonesis. Hypo, so a decrease in sound on the test. And let's have a look at the placement for that one. Hypophonesis is under physical examination, procedures and organ system status. So it is a test result. And it's under physical examination. It doesn't specify which type of test it is that's been performed. And I think that's because, as Dorland says, it could be a number of tests which have this result. It could be sounds coming from auscultation, maybe cardiac murmur or breath sounds. When I did some more references in preparation, and it seems that it's due to increase of air, potentially in the pleural cavity, which vibrates, or it could be due to cardiac murmur, but there were a number of different references, but it all seemed to be around the chest, so physical examination findings. Let's go back to where we were then. So our learning points here is that it's important that we're clear on the meaning and the site of the report. And if you feel uneasy about that at any time, you can query the term. But ideally, we would have more information, exactly what's going on here. What does it mean? Do we have a diagnosis that's associated with it? But if we don't have any more information and we have to code it, we would code it to physical examination abnormal. It's not related to hearing, it's related to the sounds that are heard on either a percussion test from tapping with fingers or from use of stethoscopes around the chest. So physical examination abnormal is what we would code that one to, commonly the chest. And with that one, I'm going to hand over to you, Caroline. Do we have any questions?
No, we just had one attendee who wasn't able to hear the audio. I just sent her. Oh. I've just sent the toll-free number to everybody.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Caroline. That's good.
Okay, then I will share my screen now. Now you see the toll-free number. Here we are. So the next one. In our next example, it is reported that an intrauterine device is temporarily missing in the uterus. So do we know what this is referring to? We know that it is a device-related event. This is for sure. But is this verbatim describing an IOD dislocation or an IOD expulsion or an erroneous imaging finding, or something else? So the wording temporarily missing is somehow confusing. And what would be the most appropriate LLT, or would we need to query to clarify the background? Let us first again check in the browser. Let me go to my browser now. Here I am. Let me log in. And I will do it in advanced search. I will look for LLTs that contain the string IOD or which contain uterine device in search. So here we are. We have embedded IUD, we have IUD breakage, complication, dislocation, expulsion, not visible. Let's start with the IUD embedded. Right-click, go to browser, and here we are in the hierarchy, and we can look at all the neighbors. So we have the device dislocation. That's the first one that we can find here that could be applicable to our verbatim. And under device dislocation, you will find extrauterine intra-abdominal localization of IUD, so something very specific. This is not what has been reported. We have IUD dislocation, IUD migration, and IUD not visible. So this is what has been reported, IUD not visible, temporarily not visible. So this would be the best approximation. And it is grouped under PT device dislocation. So what else do we have? We have the device expulsion. Of course, if an IUD is not visible, then it could also be an expulsion, but we are told it's temporarily not visible. So it cannot be an expulsion. And then we have device issue, very vague term. And under device issue, you will find LLT IUD threats not visible. So something also, we are not told that the IUD threats are not visible. We are told that the complete IUD is not visible. So the IUDs are echogenic, and that's why you can see them in ultrasound. So this is the first choice for evaluation of the positioning of IUDs. It's ultrasound. So let us now check whether we find something suitable in the investigation SOC, doing a top-down search that relates to ultrasound findings. So we would look for reproductive organ and breast investigation, and here we have the imaging procedures. And all these, it's breast, pelvis, mammogram, salpingogram. But here we have ultrasound uterus abnormal, and underneath Doppler ultrasound uterine arteries abnormal and ultrasound uterus abnormal. So this looks like if something was wrong with the uterus. What we have reported here is that the device, the IUD, is not visible in the uterus. What we could also check, is always recommendable to do so, to look into the investigations, imaging, histopathology procedures, NEC. Maybe there's something suitable there. Imaging procedures, NEC. But here, again, I cannot see something that is imaging procedure artifact. Well, we don't know whether this was an artifact. We are not told that this is an artifact. We only know that the IUD was temporarily not visible. So let's get back here. So what would you do? How would you handle this report? Which LLT would you select based on what you just saw? Or would you seek clarification in this instance? IUD not visible? Yes. Yeah, this seems to be common choice here. IUD not visible. I think it's really the best approximation because this is what we are told. The IUD cannot be seen. So thank you for your feedback here. So the wording of this verbatim is contradictory. I think we can agree on this. Hard to believe that an IUD is only temporarily missing in the uterus. Either it can be visualized or it cannot be visualized. Of course, provided that the examination is done professionally. We looked for suitable device complication terms and also LLTs representing abnormal imaging results, and the best approximation was LLT IUD not visible but this LLT does not capture the temporary aspect. In the end, despite all research, it is still unclear what really happened, what is really meant here. So our final suggestion is to seek clarification from the reporter to find out whether an expulsion, dislocation in the uterus, embedment in the uterine wall, or migration, dislocation into the abdominal cavity occurred, because this is, of course, medically relevant information, and it's medically relevant to really distinguish these situations, these findings. But in many instances, especially in pharmacovigilance, you will not be able to get further information. No further information becomes available, and then LLT IOD not visible would be a good approximation of what has been reported here. Assigning this LLT, we would take the worst case approach, assuming that the device is still in the body. But if you would keep it more vague, if you would like to keep it more vague, of course, also LLT and PT device issue would be an option. Any questions, Jane?
No questions on that one, Caroline.
Okay, then I will continue with the next one. Here it is reported that a frenulectomy took place. So what type of medical information is actually reported here? It is an excision. Yes, it is a surgical intervention. But is the surgical site clear? Which anatomical structure was excised here? Which LLT would be appropriate? So when looking into Dorlins again, you'll find that frenum and frenulum are considered synonyms, and the same holds true for frenectomy and frenulectomy. So the description that we have here of frenulum, and we have the reference to frenum, so these are considered synonyms. It's a small fold of integument or mucous membrane that checks, curbs, or limits the movements of an organ or part of the anatomy. So use your browser based on this information. How would you approach this verbatim? Which LLT would you select or would you query? Frenulectomy. Query for anatomical site. Query for site. Query for location. Query for site. Soft tissue excision. Yeah, most of you are voting for querying for the anatomical site, and this is correct, and I can show you why. Because if I go back to the basic search now, if I enter frenectomy, you will see that we get two hits. One is labial frenectomy, and labial frenectomy is considered is under dental and gingival therapeutic procedures, under head and neck therapeutic procedures, in the surgical sock, of course, and the lingual frenectomy, tongue tie operation, also under the same HLT and HLGT. But if I now enter frenulectomy, then you will see that there's another term in MedDRA, penile frenulectomy. And here, of course, this is under male genital tract therapeutic procedures. So you can clearly see that this term, the reported verbatim, is ambiguous. It needs to be clarified because it can relate to a genital frenectomy, but also to a tongue operation, labial operation. Let me switch back. So we saw that our verbatim is ambiguous and could relate to labial frenectomy, lingual frenectomy, or penile frenulectomy. So we would need to query and would need to clarify the anatomical site. And most of you have suggested this. But again, if no further information is available, then we could select soft tissue excision. And this is what somebody also provided, soft tissue excision. This is something Jane and I have previously thought, well, the only thing that we could use is really surgery. And we were made aware of this PT in MEDRA because it's, of course, more specific. Whatever this frenulectomy is referring to, it is soft tissue that is affected here. And so, therefore, soft tissue excision is a very good term to choose if no clarification can be obtained. Any questions, Jane?
No questions. Nobody's commented. Nobody's disagreed with us today, Caroline, at all. So
That's
good.
Next one. We will now address new verbatims. The other ones we carried over from the last session because we didn't make all examples. So these are now new, and they refer to congenital disorders, gene mutations, and terms that relate to infections or infectious agents. So all topics mentioned as topics of interest by previous attendees, and some of the verbatims were also suggested by previous attendees. Here's the first one. An X-linked retinitis pigmentosa that is associated with a mutation in the RPGR gene is reported. Now, what is being reported here and what needs to be captured? Can we find a suitable combination term, or do we have to split code? How can we approach this verbatim here? First, we will need some clarity about the reported condition retinitis pigmentosa. The term relates to a group of eye disorders affecting the retina, causing progressive vision loss, and most affected patients become blind when they are adults. And in most cases, the signs and symptoms of retinitis pigmentosa are limited to the vision loss. And then this disease is called non-syndromic. And there are several types of this non-syndromic disease, distinguished by the pattern of inheritance. There is an autosomal dominant or recessive inheritance, and also the X-linked one. So in our patient, the X-linked form of the disease was reported. Now, RPGR gene stands for retinitis pigmentosa GTPase regulator gene. And here in this reference in Medline Plus, no synonyms are mentioned in here, but we could look for, but in literature you sometimes find RP3 instead of RPGR. So RP3 can be considered a synonym for this RPGR gene. So this mutation accounts for about 70% of all cases of the X-linked retinitis pigmentosa. So not all cases, it's not really pathognomonic for this disease, and it's not specific for the disease because these RPGR gene mutations can be found in other eye disorders, congenital eye disorders as well. Now, based on what you just heard, which LLT or LLTs would you now select for the reported condition? X-linked retinitis pigmentosa associated with mutation in RPGR gene. And Jane has put it in the chat for you. X-linked chromosomal disorder, retinitis pigmentosa gene mutation. Retinitis pigmentosa, yes, that's the underlying disease. And gene mutation, yeah. Correct. Code to retinitis pigmentosa or split to also capture gene mutation. Correct. Thank you again. Let's continue here and switch again to my browser. Here we are. So if I look for retinitis pigmentosa, here it is already. And Here we have a direct hit. If I go to the browser again, it's of course in the congenital SOC, it's an inherited disease. Here it is, retinitis pigmentosa. And you see that there's no further differentiation regarding mode of inheritance or specific gene mutation here, and also not in the whole HLT retinal disorders congenital. So what we can choose in order to capture the underlying disease is the retinitis pigmentosa, LLT. And the NOS term is not suitable because we have more information. We know it's an X-linked, and we know that we know the gene mutation that is connected to this disease. So we need to split code because we don't have a combination term here. And if I now look for RPG in order to capture the RPGR gene and also the RPGase regulator, not only the abbreviation, and search, we have no results. Also, when I go with RP3, the synonym, no results. So what you could do now is to check whether there is a supplemental term already available. So a term that a change request that was already approved for the next version release, that next MEDRA version 24.1 that will be released in September. So let's do the same search again, RPG. Here we are, search, no hits, and the RP3, no hits. So we won't find any specific term for this specific gene mutation in MEDRA. So if I now switch back to the released version, so the current version of MEDRA, so the only thing that we could do is to see whether we have gene mutation. Here it is. And if I again go to the browser, you see where it's located. It's of course also in congenital. It has only one LLT gene mutation. And here you see all the different mutations that have already been added to MEDRA. So many of them. And this area is still evolving, also based on new therapeutic targets. So one of you have suggested chromosomal abnormalities, so the X-linked, an X-linked chromosomal abnormality. But chromosomal abnormalities it's a different concept. Gene mutations are smaller parts of the gene material that are affected. Chromosomal abnormalities really affect the whole chromosome. So that's why the chromosomal abnormalities would not be suitable. Here are our learning points. We saw that not all X-linked retinitis pigmentosa cases are associated with an RPGR gene mutation, so it cannot be considered a distinctive sign for the disease, and it may be relevant for future gene therapeutic approaches as well. So it's worth to capture. And I looked it up and I saw that first phase 1 and 2 studies have already been conducted to repair this mutation via viral vectors. That is why we should capture the condition and the underlying gene mutation, because it's medically relevant information. We looked for matches in MEDRA, but found no suitable LLTs. So in this instance, it would be appropriate to submit a change request to the MSSO to get a specific term, because currently only the vague LLT gene mutation can be assigned. And here are our final suggestions. So we would go to LLT-PT retinitis pigmentosa and to LLT and PT gene mutation. And of course, if you are working in this area, if this specific gene mutation is relevant for your products, then it would be recommendable to submit a change request. Any questions, Jane?
No, we don't have any questions or comments at that time, Carol-Ann. No.
Okay, then I give it back to you.
Thank you very much. So I will share my screen. So our next example is another one with a genetic mutation, hypertriglyceridemia due to Tangier disease with mutation-induced ABCA1 deficit. So what have we got here? This is quite a mouthful, and again, Carol-Ann's going to put it in the chat. So if you can't remember it all, then you'll have it there you can refer back to. Is the verbatim clear enough, first of all? So when I first look at this and think what's being reported, I see firstly the hypertriglyceridemia, and we probably all understand what that means. But then we've got the Tangier disease as the underlying cause, apparently, and a mutation-induced. So do these go together? Is this something, can we find something that would capture all of that, or do we need to select multiple LLTs? That's what first goes through my mind when I look at this term. So we'll do some referencing, and when we look at, firstly, let's look at Tangier disease as the underlying disease. And this tells us that Tangier disease is an inherited disorder characterized by significantly reduced levels of high-density lipoprotein, or HDL. So it is something that is a disorder of fat metabolism, and it is an inherited disorder. Signs and symptoms include elevated amount of fat in the blood, so mild hypertriglyceridemia, disturbances in nerve function, orange tonsils, all around the fat. Then the causes in this article tells us that it's caused by the ABCA1 gene, and that's what we've had reported. So I feel, looking at this, that the three things do go together. So I'm happy that we've got consistency in what's been reported there. But the question is, do we need to capture, can we do it with one LLT, or do we need to capture three? Mutations in the ABCA1 gene prevent the release of cholesterol and phospholipids from the cells. So this is what we're being told. So further research, we looked at the ABCA1 gene, which is what we were told in our verbatim, and this is ATP binding capacity, binding cassette subfamily A, member 1. That's what the ABCA1 means, which might be more manageable of a mouthful. And this gene belongs to a group of genes called ATP binding cassette family, which provide instructions for making proteins that transport molecules across cell membranes. So it's around the fat metabolism. The gene is related. The Tangier disease is always due to this ABCA1 genetic mutation, not like the retinitis pigmentosa, where some cases were and some cases weren't. So here we know that it's always due to that. And so let's see where we'll go from here. So of those, what would you select based on what we've told you so far? So you can select any of these that you think are appropriate. If you were coding it, would you select 1, 2, 3? Would you select all of those? What would you do? Remember what we know about coding. Remember the basic principles of coding that we have from our guidelines. What would you select here? I see some of you are still voting, so good to see. Slowing down. Let's see where your votes have cast so far. Tangier disease is there, the leading choice with 50%, approximately 50%. Some of you would also select hypertriglyceridemia. Some of you would select gene mutation and the ATP binding cassette transporter A1 deficiency. So all those terms are available in MEDRA. It's a question of which ones we need to select. And this is your final vote, the scores. So I'm going to browse. There's something I just want to show you. I won't spend a long time on the browser, but I just want to show you something. So if I look up Tangier disease, what we were saying, do we need to capture all of those? They've all been reported in our in our verbatim, but do we need to capture them all? Now, you may have seen this when you had a look in preparation for coming along today, or when you looked at your browser. So if I go to the browser and show you where Tangier disease is placed, we see here that it's multiaxial. It does have a link to metabolism, but primarily, you see by the icon, primarily it's a congenital disorder. And if we come down here, we can look at it. There it is, Tangier disease. There is the PT, and underneath it, we have two LLTs. One of them is the copy, as we'd expect, but then look at the other one, ATP binding cassette transporter deficiency, A1 deficiency. It's an LLT underneath Tangier disease. So it's a synonym, or it's so closely related that it's regarded as a synonym or quasi-synonym for Tangier disease. So when we see that, we know that we don't need to capture this ATP binding capacity. There's no point capturing both of those LLTs because they link to the same PT. So we don't need to capture that one. So that's one that we don't need to capture. So something else, I'm going to leave the browser now. I'm going to show you something else that we may want to bear in mind. In the MEDRA points, term selection points to consider, we have guidance on how to code a diagnosis that's been reported with signs and symptoms. And as you probably know, the preferred approach is to only capture the diagnosis if the signs and symptoms are characteristic of that diagnosis. So if we have a diagnosis like Tangier disease with a symptom like hypertriglyceridemia, the preferred approach would be to just code Tangier disease. We don't need to capture hypertriglyceridemia because we've got that, it's already part of the diagnosis. So this is what we've learned from this example. We use our medical references so that we understand the condition and its characteristic signs and symptoms. We apply the points to consider guidance for coding of the diagnosis. And if we're happy that the sign and symptom is characteristic, then we don't need to capture those separately. We don't need to ask for a split. We would just code it to Tangier disease, LLT, and a PT. And the note there, just to remind you what I showed you, that the LLT of ATP binding cassette transporter A1 deficiency is also grouped under the PT. So that complicated term boils down to just one LLT in the end once we've applied the logic. Any thoughts on that one from the group, Carol-Ann?
No, nothing. We had a comment that what you just explained, that this all relates to Tangier's disease, so that one LLT would suffice here.
That's good. Thank you very much. I should say, if any of you out there are experts in any of these fields, do let us know, and we can unmute you. There's a lot of you online, so we don't unmute the group as a general way of doing it, but we can unmute you. So if you're sitting there and you're getting very frustrated that you can't share your expertise and you want to enlighten us further, please do let us know, send us a comment, and we can unmute you if you have something to add to it that you want to share verbally. So I'll do the next one now. This one is, any comment?
Yeah, here's a comment. What if hypertriglyceridemia had increase or decrease in grade? Don't they need to be split?
An increase or decrease of what you mean? Had it been worsened?
Yeah.
You mean had it worsened?
Of the condition.
You could do, but generally worsening terms, when you have LLTs in MEDRA which are worsening, they code to the same PT, which is the level for analysis anyway. So unless it was something very relevant to your, unless it was something relevant to your own clinical study or your drug, I wouldn't worry to capture it as a worsening. What do you think, Carol-Ann?
Yeah, I agree.
That's good. So thank you.
The characteristic sign and symptom of the disease. So based on the PTC document, it doesn't need to be captured.
No. So the next one we have is BARD1 or BARD1, gene variant breast cancer risk. So what's going on here? What's this one? Breast cancer risk. What's the actual finding here? And then what would be the most appropriate LLT? So again, when we go to reference it, we found an article that explains the role of the BARD1 gene in what we find is that it partners with another gene called BRCA1, and they partner, it says there, that it partners with the BRCA1 associated ring domain protein, BARD1, and other tumor suppressor proteins to mediate the initial nucleolytic resection of DNA lesions and recruitment and regulation of recombinase RAD51. So in simple, not being an expert on this, to me, reading this, what I understand is that the two genes, they're together, crosstalk, they partner and they communicate, and its cofactors and antagonists will illuminate the molecular basis of cancers that arise from a deficiency or misregulation of chromosome damage repair and replication fork maintenance. So it's when there's a problem with these two genes that link together, that's when we start getting abnormalities in cell replication and tumor development. That's a very simplified version of that. So now, having told you that, which of these LLTs or which combination of these would you select? Here's the selection of them. We've got breast cancer, family history of cancer, gene mutation, BRCA1 gene mutation, disease risk factor, predisposition to disease, or cancer gene carrier. You can have a selection of these, you're not limited to one. It starts getting complicated, doesn't it, when you see the references like that, unless you're an expert in that area. So what have we got here? I'll just give you a minute more to vote. Sometimes we have feedback that our attendees would like us to allow more time for voting. So I'll give you a chance to really think about these. So let's see what your thoughts are. So cancer gene carrier seems to be the, oh, you're changing your mind, all of you, suddenly there. There was let me click again and we'll lock it so no more of you can change your mind. So let's go down them. I shouldn't have said that. Cancer gene carrier seems to be the most popular one. Breast cancer, first one. Well, has our verbatim told us the patient has breast cancer? It mentioned a breast cancer risk. Didn't say they had breast cancer, and there's no guidance, there's nothing in the PTC that says if somebody has a risk of a disease, you code the disease. If they have a risk and they haven't got it, we don't want to capture it. So breast cancer is not one I'd select. Family history of cancer, no, we don't know anything about their family history. Gene mutation, well, yes, it does seem that there is a gene mutation. BRCA1 gene mutation, well, looking at that reference, it seemed that the BARD1 gene mutation, the BARD1 gene wasn't the same as a BRCA gene, but they're linked, aren't they? They do communicate, they're partnered, so it's not the same. And then we have the two terms, disease risk factor and predisposition to disease. Both of those seem to be possible to capture what's happening here. Our patient is at risk of a disease, or do they have a predisposition? What's the difference between those two terms? Or the other option is cancer gene carrier. Is that one more specific than gene mutation because it mentions cancer? Well, I still feel we're not quite there yet, are we? So let's have a look at the browser. I'll just have a quick look here. Again, I won't spend too long on it. I'll just show you where the mutation terms, we saw them up here, didn't we, when we went congenital disorders, and we've got the congenital chromosomal abnormalities gene And gene, we've got them there, gene mutations as an HLT. We can have a look there. We can have a look for our BARD gene. No, we've got the BRCA1 gene mutation and the BRCA2 gene mutation, but it's, from what we could understand, it's not the same. It is a different gene, so we wouldn't be wanting to select that one. So let's have a look at our predisposition to disease. We've got predisposition to disease and disease risk factor, haven't we? Let's have a look at disease risk. We've got disease risk factor here as an LLT with a PT of disease risk factor. And when we look at the hierarchy, it's in the social circumstances system organ class. It's a social issue, lifestyle issue. And what about predisposition to disease? We look for the word predisposition and search for that. Where's that LLT? Here it is. And again, let's look at the hierarchy. This one has a PT of disease susceptibility. It's in the general signs and symptoms, general disorders, and administration site. So there's clearly a difference in the way MEDRA regards these two LLTs. How do we know whether it's better to select the predisposition, which is in the general disorders, or the social circumstances term, the risk factor? So again, we went to Dorland's as our go-to medical reference, and we looked up the two words, predisposition and risk factor. Predisposition is a latent susceptibility to disease that may be activated under certain conditions such as stress, or risk factor is a clearly defined occurrence or characteristic that's been associated with an increased risk of a subsequently occurring disease, and that it may or may not be causal. So the difference here is that the predisposition is something to do with the patient. It's a susceptibility inherent or internal to that patient, whereas a risk factor is something that may be internal, but it could be external. Risk factor could be smoking, it could be pollution, working environment, it could be a number of things. It might be occupational, climate, it could be anything, a risk factor, whereas predisposition is something about that patient. And that explains why the risk factor, being broader, is in the social circumstances, whereas the predisposition is in the general disorders and administration site conditions. And this just summarizes that for you. You see here, disease susceptibility, disease risk factor is social circumstances, and so is familial risk factor. So that just shows you it there. So based on what we've seen so far, it's important to distinguish the cancer risk from a diagnosis. It would be wrong to code this term to an actual cancer LLT. Check the reported risk factors and the gene mutations. See if you can find them in MEDRA. Look also for synonyms of those mutations. And you saw that when Caroline did her retinitis pigmentosa example. If the mutation term is not available in MEDRA, you may want to request that it's added to a future version. And based on what we've seen so far, we would code it to predisposition to disease because it is something inherent to the patient, and we would select cancer gene carrier. We did think about gene mutation, but when we reflected on it, and particularly after this morning's session, when we gave this session, we've decided that cancer gene carrier is probably a better match for what's been reported here. So now's your chance. Do you have any thoughts or comments you want to make on this example?
Nothing came in so far.
Oh, no? You're very quiet, all of you. So thank you for that. And the next one I'll do before I hand back is genetic testing for DM1 because of learning disability. So what have we got here? We've got genetic testing being performed, and they've told us it's for DM1. Well, they're testing, so they're testing for something, and it's because of learning disability. So again, we've got three things here, haven't we? Is it clear enough to code? Do we need to clarify the abbreviation DM1? Is it what is actually being reported, and do we need one LLT or several? So When we looked for DM1, so with any abbreviation, as you all know, as coders, you do need to be very careful with abbreviation. Is it unambiguous? Could it mean anything else? Well, could DM1, is it diabetes mellitus type 1? But would that fit with genetic testing and learning disability? So we referenced it and we found that it was myotonic dystrophy. That seems to be the most common, the predominant, or the overarching one that we found when we referenced it. And we found there were two types of myotonic dystrophy. So this is a type of muscular dystrophy, myotonic dystrophy, type 1 and type 2, muscle weakness, and it tells us that type 1 is the more severe one. Two variations. Type 1 is the mild and congenital types. Mild myotonic dystrophy is apparent in mid to late adulthood. Affected individuals typically have mild myotonia and cataracts. Congenital myotonia dystrophy is often apparent at birth. Characteristic features include weak muscle tone, inward, upward turning of the foot, club foot, breathing problems, delayed development, and intellectual disability. So type 2 tends to be milder than type 1. Okay, so this is what we know. So we've shown there that learning disability does fit with an understanding of DM1 as being myotonic dystrophy. And this is what they would do the genetic testing for. So now your turn, use your browser and give us the most appropriate LLT that you think for that term. What would you code this to? Learning disability gene mutation identification test. Yeah, learning disability, karyotype analysis, learning disability. Gene sequencing and myotonic dystrophy. So somebody's going for the myotonic dystrophy. A few of you are going for either gene mutation identification test or another genetic term, cytogenetic analysis, and learning disability. So we've got three, seems like there's three components here and you're looking to code those. So thank you for that. So should we go to Browse Medra? We'll go again briefly just to Browse Medra. We'll have a look here at myotonic dystrophy. Myotonic dystrophy. Let's have a look and see. Do we have the type 1, type 2? What do we have in Medra? We have myotonic dystrophy. There it is as the LLT. I'll go to the browser and have a look at the EBC. It's multi-axial, primarily congenital as we would expect, but it has links to 3 other system organ classes. And we come down here and there it is. We find it down here, myotonic dystrophy. And when I look underneath it, I don't have type 1 and type 2, but I do have this new term here, this new LLT that we haven't come across in our research, Steinert disease. Steinert disease. So is this one type 1, type 2? What fits here? So I'm having a look at this because the logic to me is if they're doing genetic testing, they must be thinking, is it a provisional diagnosis? You'll know that the points to consider document suggests that when you have a provisional diagnosis and you code it as if it was confirmed with the signs and symptoms, that's the preferred approach. So let's have a look. So we did some further research based on that Steinert disease. And what we found was that myotonic dystrophy type 1, a synonym of that is Cashman-Steinert disease. And this is what we're seeing in the browser. Why we're seeing that LLT is a synonym or for myotonic dystrophy type 1. So our learning points here, we would determine the actual finding. We would evaluate whether DM1 can be taken as a suspect diagnosis. And to some extent, you have your medical judgment here. Now, we've looked at it. We've looked at what's the like. Firstly, is DM1 an acceptable abbreviation? We feel it is based on what else we know. So we would then capture the gene mutation identification test separately if you need to, and we would code it as a provisional diagnosis of myotonic dystrophy and also capture the symptom of learning disability. So the LLT of learning disability, we would select the LLT of Steinert disease because our referencing seems to say that is the type 1 and then it has a PT, as I showed you, myotonic dystrophy. And depending on how you're entering it, we would code it to gene mutation identification test. So this would be something, if you're working in pharmacovigilance, you could add that to your test field. Or if you're in clinical trials, it wouldn't be an adverse event, so it wouldn't be appropriate to capture there. So that's why we say it's optional. Any thoughts on this one?
There's one comment from Henk. He's saying that coding to an LLT to an LLT for myotonic dystrophy is making an assumption of a diagnosis that was not reported. They are testing whether the person has DM1 because of the learning disability. Yes, I agree, but you know, there's a learning disability, and somehow they are looking for the cause of this learning disability, and one of the suspect diagnoses is the myotonic dystrophy type 1, and that's why they are doing genetic testing. So we, both Jane and I, we really agreed that this can be taken as a suspect diagnosis. And based on the PTC document, the suspect diagnosis is to be coded as it was, if it was confirmed, and together with the corresponding signs and symptoms. In this instance, the learning disability.
We did look at that. Thank you for raising that, Hank. Yes, we did, didn't we, Caroline? We discussed this and we considered it, and it would depend also, I suppose, on if you're where you're working, if you have the opportunity to follow up and find out the result of the testing over a clinical trial or what. But we decided that we would, based on this one, that we would consider it, as you say, provisional, but we recognized that maybe not everyone would feel comfortable in doing that.
Yeah. Oh, there's one attendee who's saying that they have a patient in their family, and she is saying that probably there are more symptoms in this patient than just the learning disability. Yes, I agree, but in this instance, this is what was reported here.
Thank you.
And then Lisa is asking as well, would you code learning disability if it is a symptom? Because we didn't do so with the hypertriglyceridemia. Would you like to?
Well, yeah, either one of us can do that one, Caroline. The difference is that here, as we've seen, we don't have a diagnosis yet. So myotonic dystrophy, we've been told it's suspected or a provisional diagnosis. If it was a confirmed diagnosis, as it was before with the Tangier disease, then the med-return selection points to consider tells us that we should just code the diagnosis if it's a confirmed diagnosis and if the symptom is characteristic. But if the diagnosis hasn't yet been confirmed, the preferred approach is to code everything, code the diagnosis and the signs and symptoms. And if you have a look in the PTC document, you'll see what we mean there by that. Okay, anything else, Caroline, or anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, she's now asking whether once confirmed, would you delete it? Well, this is rather data management side. It depends on data entry conventions, data management conventions.
Yes, companies work differently, but you could do depending on how you operate. Okay, so with that, Caroline, I'm going to hand back over to you to take us through our next examples.
So here we are. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So we are now done with the congenital diseases and all these gene mutations, and we'll start with verbatims that relate either to infections or microbiologic test results. In our first example, it is reported that a sputum sample was tested positive for pseudomonas. Here the usual questions we will have to ask ourselves: is this verbatim clear or does it need clarification? So what is actually being reported? Is it rather a diagnosis or is it a test result? We have to decide this. Is the anatomical site clear? What is sputum referring to? And do we have to split code to capture all this information? And what would be the most appropriate LLT or LLTs? So when you look into Dorlins and look for sputum, then you see matter ejected from the respiratory tract through the mouth, called also expectoration. So non-native speakers like myself sometimes relate sputum to spitting up, to vomiting, and get confused because they are not sure whether sputum could also refer to the GI tract. So this is now clarified. Sputum relates to the respiratory tract. But what about the need for split coding? Our verbatim contains the information sputum and information about a specific infectious agent, namely pseudomonas. And when looking into matter term selection points to consider the document, we can find the following. We find one section that addresses splitting, but it does not provide examples for investigational terms. Just one example similar to what we had before with gene mutations and cancer, specific cancer types, and you see that we are asked here to split these terms, but no investigational terms. And there's another section that address combination terms with location-specific and microorganism-specific information. But again, they only refer to diagnosis, pneumococcal pneumonia, Klebsiella kidney infection. So they do not address investigational test results, combination terms for investigational test results. So we will have to find a solution ourselves here. So how would you approach our reported finding positive Pseudomonas sputum sample? Which LLT would you select? And here you have a multiple choice question. Would you choose and select bacteria sputum identified, or gastroenteritis pseudomonas, or sputum culture positive, or pseudomonas test positive, or would you code to pseudomonas bronchitis? What would you do? Let's look at what you are suggesting. So most of you tend to code to Pseudomonas test positive. Others would also code to Pseudomonas bronchitis or bacteria sputum identified, even sputum culture positive. So let's log the poll here. Here we are. So the vast majority is going for Pseudomonas test positive. And now let's again look into the browser. So if I enter sputum and limit my search to the investigation SOC and search, then I will have quite a number of hits, but there's no LLT that would also include the information Pseudomonas. So we have the LLT bacteria sputum identified. So if I look at the hierarchy, you see that on PT level, the sputum information gets lost. So the only thing that we get on PT level is bacterial test positive. So more vague term, because we know the exact class of infectious agent here. The exact bacterium is Pseudomonas. And Therefore, bacteria sputum identifier would not be an appropriate code assignment. It's less specific on PT level, and PT level is really the one that is relevant for data retrieval, data presentation, and data analysis. So if I now would look for pseudomonas and positive and search, then I get 2 hits. We don't know the exact species here. We only have the information pseudomonas. So if I now go to the browser and look for this term, long list of different bacteria. So here it is, pseudomonas test positive. So it's under pseudomonas test positive. So it's much more specific than our previous term, bacterial test positive. Of course, we could also, now I will clear the selection and go to the infections infestation SOC and also look for pseudomonas and search. And we get plenty of hits here, like for instance, pneumonia due to pseudomonas. And if I again look into the hierarchy, into this HLT pseudomonal infections, then you see cystitis, endocarditis, gastroenteritis, pneumonia, so a lot of different infections caused by pseudomonas. But these are diagnoses. And what has been reported here is an investigational result. So remember, MEDRA clearly distinguishes diagnosis, here these infections, from investigational findings. And as coders, we should not derive a diagnosis, like here the infection, from a microbiological test result. Let me switch back. Here we are. This is just a reminder of what I've just demonstrated. So bacteria sputum identified would just end up in PT bacterial test positive, whereas the pseudomonas test positive really is to be found on PT level, so much more specific. And all these infection terms, please do not assign them. If you have an investigational test result, then please clearly distinguish these test results from related diagnosis when coding. When looking at such verbatim, prioritize the information taking into account the MEDRA hierarchy and code as specific as possible, considering the PT level as well. And consider the creation of internal coding conventions for these coding scenarios, because you could see that there is not much guidance in the PTC document for such terms, and coders will need more detailed guidance and training to achieve coding consistency for such scenarios. Any questions, Jane?
Yeah, we've just got a couple of comments, Caroline, from Hank. Agrees with you that the presence of an organism doesn't equal infection, so you must never assume an infection. Thank you for that, Hank. That's exactly our thoughts on that one. Another comment there that many companies handle these verbatims differently, and some want to code to the specific organism test positive, while other companies want to code to the specific test and what was identified, like bacteria sputum identified. And I think you addressed that when you showed the difference in the hierarchy and what's captured at the PT level, didn't you?
Yes. So it's the positive pseudomonas test LLT is more specific, also on PT level. But of course, you could take a different approach based on specific considerations for your products. But then this is what I meant with the internal coding conventions. Then these rules have to be documented, because otherwise you will get inconsistency in your coding.
Thank you. And another comment, Jackie's asking, could we split this and then capture sputum culture?
Yes, we could. Here we are with our final suggestions. So our suggestion would be pseudomonas test positive, because this is the most specific information that we can capture also on PT level. And in drug safety, the sputum sample can be captured in the E2B data element for test names. So LLT-PT sputum test could be entered there in this specific data element of the E2B report. But this is only valid for pharmacovigilance. In clinical studies, you often have the problem that you cannot link. If you split terms, then you cannot link them to each other, and then you are somehow duplicating events. So sometimes you really have to prioritize the information and come up with rules how to approach these coding scenarios. Further comments, Jane?
No further comments on that one. No further comments.
Next one. Here, heavy growth of proteus mirabilis in the bronchial lavage of a patient is reported. When looking at this verbatim, it is clear and it's understandable, I think so. But which anatomical site again is affected here? And can we catch all information with one MEDRA term, or do we have to prioritize again the information that is provided, or should we rather split code here? Now, what is a bronchoalveolar lavage or a bronchoalveolar washing? What it is used for? It is a procedure that is sometimes performed in conjunction with a bronchoscopy to collect a fluid sample from the lower airways to diagnose lung disorders like bacterial or fungal infections, or also pulmonary cancer. So in our example, the bronchial lavage sample revealed heavy growth of proteus mirabilis, so indicating a potential infection. So which LLT would you select for this verbatim heavy growth of proteus mirabilis in bronchial lavage now? We have a combination term, we have the bronchial lavage, and we have the information about the infectious agent. Proteus mirabilis test positive. Yes. So most of you are going into this direction. Thank you for that. So again, let us look into the browser. So when I look for bronchial lavage, oops, I still have the pseudomonas in there, and I will not find anything. Search. Oh, my search is still limited, so there's a warning. I didn't see it. So I have, of course, to clear my selection. Here is our bronchoalveolar lavage, and there's one abnormal term. So let's see, go to browser, what LLTs are underneath. Well, it's just the bronchoalveolar lavage abnormal. So we would lose completely the information about the detection of this infectious agent. So this would not be a suitable term just alone. So it's in SOC investigation. Now let's again, let us look for proteus now and limit it to the investigation SOC to not look at all the infections. And here is our proteus mirabilis test positive. So we can even capture the species here, and the PT is then proteus test positive. So this would really capture the infectious agent. So maybe we can find a more general term, like this is a bacterial culture, of course. So can we find something, a bacterial culture that could combine this information, bacterial culture, with the respiratory tract? But again, this is not available, so we only have bacterial culture positive and on PT level, you only have bacterial test positive. So now what to do? Let me switch back again. This is what we just saw. Bacterial culture positive, it's just under bacterial test positive, so we would lose the information that this was a culture on PT level. The bronchoalveolar lavage abnormal does not contain the information that this is a detection of an infectious agent, and it's grouped under histopathology procedures, and the most specific term that we can find is proteus mirabilis test positive. So this would be the best approximation to our verbatim. So this was the infectious agent that was identified in our sample. So prioritize again the information received, applying medical judgment and taking into account the MEDRA hierarchy. And as mentioned before, it is advisable to document your prioritization rules for such terms in your internal coding conventions. So if you would rather go for the specific test specimen, then of course you would also need to document this. Our final suggestion here is to code this verbatim to proteus mirabilis test positive under PT proteus test positive. And in drug safety, again, you can capture the origin of the investigation sample by entering LLT bronchoalveolar lavage fluid analysis into the E2B data element for test names in the ICSR, so the electronic individual case safety report. Any related questions?
The only comment, we had a comment there, which I think you've addressed already, that some companies may want to capture the LLT of bronchoalveolar lavage abnormal. So yes, but as you said, Caroline, we looked at that one, didn't we? But the histopathology suggested to us we were more interested in the infection. Yeah. Just a comment on that one.
Okay, I try one more.
Yeah, should we try one more and then we'll...
Or shall we?
Yeah, I think you can probably. We've got a few minutes. So
yeah, I think it's a short one. So next example here, it is reported that blood cultures were positive for E. coli. And again, are we clear about what is meant here, what exactly is being reported, and which organ system is affected? And is there one suitable LLT which would capture this information, or do we have to prioritize or to split code again? So here we have different choices for you. So you could choose either Escherichia coli bacteremia, blood culture positive, septicemia due to E. coli or bacteria blood identified, or Escherichia coli test positive. What would be your preference here? Blood cultures positive to E. coli was the verbatim. Let me speed up a little bit. Let's see. Escherichia coli test positive. Yes. Most of you tend to in this direction. Some of you also would code this to Escherichia coli bacteremia or blood culture positive. Let me lock that. And again, we will look into the browser. And I will look for blood culture. So we are still with investigation SOC, yes. And I will look for terms that contain the information blood culture and search. Oh, and here we have specific LLTs for specific infectious agents, Salmonella and Staphylococcus. And if you open the hierarchy, you see that these blood culture positives are under more general terms. So they are under Salmonella test positive and also Staphylococcus test positive. So here you would lose the information about the blood culture positive and on PT level, you only have the positive test result for the specific infectious agent. So what about bacteria blood? Would this be an option? We don't have something for our E. coli. Bacterial blood identified. Here we are. Bacterial test positive. Again, we lose the information that this was a blood specimen. We on PT level, it's just the bacterial test positive. And if I clear the selection and I go for the Escherichia and bacteremia, you will see that this, again, of course, is not considered an investigational result, but it resides in infections and infestations. It's a diagnosis. So again, we would not code an investigational result, a test result, to a diagnosis. Here again, what we just saw, you see that these blood culture positives for Salmonella and for Staphylococcus, here they are only grouped under the test positive PTs, and therefore the most specific term that we can choose is really Escherichia coli test positive. Here we are. And again, we should not make a diagnosis out of these investigational findings. Based on the MEDRA rules, the best approximation to this verbatim is to code to LLT Escherichia coli test positive. It is of course tempting, I fully agree, to consider this reported event as a bacteremia and code to the specific bacteremia term for E. coli, but always clearly distinguish investigational results from diagnosis. So prioritize again the information received following the prioritization rules in MEDRA itself, as you could see for the Staphylococcus and for the Salmonella PT. And as mentioned before, create internal coding rules for these scenarios to provide guidance to coders to achieve coding consistency for these coding scenarios. And we suggest to code this to Escherichia coli test positive. And in drug safety, again, you can capture the sample type by entering blood culture in the E2B data element for test names again. Any questions?
No.
Jane?
No questions or comments on that one, Carol-Ann, but well done in fitting that in so quickly. Thank you. Shall I take back the screen now? Thank you. No comments on that one.
Okay.
But people might, if you've got any last minute comments, you can squeeze them in just before we wrap up. So I just wanted to remind you that we have been doing this now since November of last year, and we've been doing it every month. Now, next month in August, it's vacation time, particularly in Europe for Carol-Ann and I, so we won't be joining you next month, but we'll be back in September. But if you want to look back, you can see all the recordings of our previous sessions. And if you have a look under the one, they're all together in a playlist under Let's Code Together. And then some of them, they've all got the verbatim terms underneath them in the description. So if you have missed some and you want to look, you can see what verbatim terms we addressed in each of the sessions. I say this because we've been getting people commenting, asking us to do COVID-related and vaccine-related event terms, and we did some COVID and vaccine events earlier this year, and so those will be there. We can do it again, but there was a tendency, some people were saying, please, no more COVID. So just mention that there. There's some contacts here for you. I think most of you are very experienced coders. You're familiar with our help desk, our email address there, where you can download the browser or look at our website. Here's the address you need to access the change request tool for making change request proposals. There's the schedule for training that you can sign up for future sessions or access the PTC document in support documentation. The last thing to mention is you can contact us in several ways. You can email us at the help desk, mssohelp@medra.org. You can also use the online form that you submit your questions online through the website. And when you go to any page on our website now, there's a live chat that pops up. You can communicate with one of our help desk team live. If you want to join an online through your mobile phone, a discussion group, you can do so with several groups. One of them is also available for Spanish speakers, French speakers, Russian speakers. So there are the QR codes there that you can scan if you'd like to join one of those groups where you can ask questions in either Spanish, French or Russian. And in WeChat, we have some Chinese groups. So that brings us to the end of the session. We do have a survey. We're using a poll everywhere survey. So if you have been logged on, it gives you an opportunity to do your survey quickly now. Just 4 short questions. And this will allow you to tell us how we can improve. Tell us what you've enjoyed about today or what you've found frustrating. It also gives you the opportunity to send us either some topics that you would like us to address in future sessions or some actual verbatim terms. We are collecting your examples. We're using as many of them as we can. We can't guarantee when it will be, but it will be hopefully in the next few months once we resume after the summer vacation. So that's everything. You'll also get an email from us that you can use as evidence that you participated. And in that email, there is a link to another survey. So I realize we're over time. If you do need to rush off, you can give us your comments in that survey there. But I appreciate it if you can spare us a moment now. So otherwise, apologies that we are over time. And it just leaves me to wish you well. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are in the world. Have a good August. I very much hope that we will see you again in September. It's great to see so many of you. Every month I'm seeing the same names in the list, which is great to see. So thank you for that. Stay safe, everyone, and enjoy August. Take care.
Thank you to everybody. And enjoy the summer. Hope to see you again in September as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Caroline. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jane.
Bye-bye.